for the context and the others who haven't had courses like this, it deals with the broad issue that Samuelson and Arrow basically were the strong articulators of a view that if we try to use the desiderata of markets and market mechanisms for clearing and for joining supply and demand, leading to an equilibrium and having a price which could be achieved where people could agree on trading about, that is to have a market work, to achieve those that this was then really using markets can be used in two ways. As a normative ideal as to what will clear a market and what will be, quote, more efficient for the suppliers and the demanders. In order for that to work, for those to work, both Samuelson and Arrow essentially convinced themselves, and most of the economists thinking about this, was that for, in Samuelson's case, for public goods, whether they're clean air generated by a factory, and where there maybe in the past have been zero government, that becomes a problem if you try to solve the problem of cleaning the air, of who pays for it, how much, how clean, how active and how stringent a criterion are people willing to pay for, and who should pay. And so if you do things like voting or saying, let's take a median voter preference kind of ideal, let's choose a median. Why won't that work? And the simple answer to Samuelson is free riders, that people will understate they'll understate how much they want to pay, but they still would like to have a free rider having as clean air as they can get without paying any taxes. And so that's the simple conclusion. But Samuelson and Arrow both basically said, so Arrow had I won't try to summarize, but the basic point was these are unstable equilibria. That is, there's no clear price which will meet these desiderata of making a decision, and therefore we have lots more uncertainty, instability, multiple potential temporary equilibria, but it's not really a stable solution. And therefore, the idea was using the normative criteria of markets does not work for proper analysis of politics. And so basically, this was termed an impossibility theorem from Samuelson and Arrow for 20, 30 years, roughly, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and the early 60s. Okay, so the major answer to that, after most important, was Duncan Black, who was here in the law school, and he basically said it depends. That the degree of that is, maybe things won't be so unstable, but it depends on the particular shape of the distribution of preferences. And so if we have a distribution of preferences that is more like a normal distribution, then maybe it will work. But if we have multi-peakedness, 3 or 4, 3 little mountains next to each other, then you can bounce from one mountain to the next mountain to the next mountain, and therefore that's unstable. And so it could depend on lobbying, it could depend on short-term noise and so forth. And if you join that with the general idea that Clark's rule, noise, life is 85% noise or instability, luck, short-term factors which don't fit with these normative or any other criteria in a simple sense, then it's normal that to be expected that life will be in good part unstable in that sense. And so not to worry about any one, that is, any one of these is too simple a deterministic conclusion that we shouldn't study politics. And people are not going to, the politicians are not going to give up just because the economists gave up. Okay, yeah, question?
Yeah, I do have a comment.
Sure, go ahead.
It does make very little sense from the political point of view, because, for example, if you take the buses that are here running around Chicago, right? There are going to be lines of buses which they don't make money, but they need to be there to bring people to the actual houses, even if they're in, far away neighborhoods, right? So of course the markets norms are not going to work in politics. That's common sense, wouldn't it? Just taking the buses as an example, there are going to be bus lines which are not going to be unprofitable.
But virtually all the bus lines are unprofitable, so they're largely heavily subsidized everywhere. But then you get to the question that if it's a reasonably public good, then how many buses will be more appropriate? And Samuelson will say, people will be strategic and they'll say, well, no subsidy. I want low taxes, but they'll still get on the bus if the bus is there. But then if the bus company then cuts them back more and more and more, then they can either go bankrupt or they'll simply cut back. You can have one bus a day or one bus a month, which is unrealistic for many. So they'll shift over to cars, they'll shift over to bicycles, they'll shift over to working at home if they lose the public good of public transit. But I mean, public transit is it's a compelling case for cities for sure that buses will make life much more efficient. But compelling case looking at that, and essentially that's where Black came in. So Black said, if it's a compelling case, that sounds more like a normal distribution. If most people feel that way, then we shouldn't have such a problem because the market should clear. But if we're getting further and further in a less dense area, then how far to go? It gets more and more uncertain. Or even in Chicago, how often should the buses run through the night, for instance? Okay, etc. So, what if we think of where and how can we connect these considerations with what has either gone later, or where can we connect that to something else? I would say what sort of the conversation we're having right here is maybe we need to add a little more about the context to join with these multiple single peakiness. I mean, these points are largely following the classic pure market model in the sense that the demand is simply citizens, and it assumes all citizens are, I won't say not quite, but they tend to be equal. They all should be involved. Maybe they can afford, say, a bus. I mean, but when we get to certain kinds of, I don't want to elaborate in the answer, but let's think about it maybe later today or as we go on, and the immediate solution which would be interesting to pursue for this course might be, what is there about the context in addition to the Duncan Black line, which you've mostly, you've given us mostly variations of Black's distribution and preferences among citizens, and clearly that's important. But where and why is that distribution is where and why do we have 2 peaks, 4 peaks, and that clearly is going on increasingly in the U.S. Congress and in many cities today. In a sense, we have multiple. So we have 4 big caucuses in the Chicago City Council. We have something like that, maybe more so in Washington, and so you could find 3 or 4 at least in easily. But that's very different than just 2. So in that sense, where and why do we have 2 or 4, and why have we seen a change from 2 or 4, or in the case of Italy, we have 30. At least we have 30 potential parties that have their names in the voting booths. Okay, so if we look at cases which vary in these kinds of clear, pretty identifiable factors, or instead of saying contemporary or alike, if we try to join examples that we have, such as the bus system or the single peakedness or the say the big multi-party context of Italy, what led to that situation which has 30 parties in Italy, or what is there about the Italian context that made it fall neither into Duncan Black's solution and its disaster from the standpoint of Arrow or Samuelson? And so, and the answer which I think I gave you briefly from Enrico Ercole when we had this discussion, and when it changed. I mean, when it changed was when the Berlin Wall went down. Berlin Wall went down. Soon thereafter, we had Berlusconi. The media became visible, and we had the collapse of the political party system in Italy, driven by corruption, if you will, to have a one-word simple label, and the populist reaction against corruption, combined with the Berlin Wall going down, saying that the Italian voters were no longer supporting the Christian Democratic Party, and they therefore they're not afraid about the communists taking over all of Italy, because the Berlin Wall went down. So the Russian tanks are not going to arrive in Milan. So if the Russian tanks are not coming to Milan, they don't worry. Therefore, they'll say, we'll stop voting for the Christian Democrats, and that in turn led to the collapse of the biggest party. But then people would say, it's not just the Christian Democrats. All of these people are actually asking for big bribes, and it's too expensive to do business or to survive in Italy at all. Vote them all out. And so that's basically what happened. So the socialists, the communists, Christian Democrats, all were voted out, and we had a whole new explosion of up to 30 parties. Okay. Now I'm describing it in somewhat journalistic manner, but these if these explain 15%, which is as good as most social science does, we're doing probably as well as single peakedness or multi-peakedness or these other things, and joining them together, and at least where and why they may join together could imply a little bit more coherent and more integrated of set of factors which join into one another into a more meaningful analysis. So that's I'm throwing that out as a way of potentially trying to put these things together. So that is to start from bits of history or things that may sound random, but maybe they're not so random if they're. I mean, what I've said is not very unique. That is, it's many people could see it. Many people have said this. Maybe that is, these may be right, but the question is, how many people were driven by how many of these considerations is the kind of thing that one could look for some evidence, or some kind of ways of somehow integrating or joining these multiple interpretations, which have largely been highly separate. Okay. So that means that's an excellent paper topic. Okay, so let's leave it for the moment. We can come back, but let's what if we hear a little bit with, well, should we go right to
culture theory?
Yeah, and have you got one, or you got lots of questions?
Yeah, but you start talking about culture theory, right?
Yes.
And
I'm asking. What should be our agenda for today?
Okay.
If you have lots of questions, we should maybe put them off. If you have one simple question, we can maybe address it quickly.
No, we'll address it later. I have
Okay,
4 or 5
okay.
questions, so.
Okay, well, 4 or 5 is good. Okay, that's fine. Let me then push on with some of,
This is a great book.
yes. The main thing on the syllabus is the background is the Protestant ethic, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, Division of Labor, Parsons, Schumpeter.
And also, if you could touch a little bit between Weber Calvinist, and the white Protestants in America, if you can join them together somewhere in the lecture.
Okay, good. Okay, let me go to the, where's my, all right. Protestant ethic. The reach is broad. He discusses uniqueness of the West, stressing rationality. He reviews several activities and considers how they're unique to the West. That is, why and how did capitalism and modernism emerge, not in China, not in India, but more in Northern Europe. And he reviews several activities: Western science, the quintessential embodiment of rational analysis; in music, the rational conceptions of harmony, counterpoint, written musical notation, which permitted the transmittal of objects of music over time, only in the West. In architecture, Gothic vaults and flying buttresses, domes. The Western University is a place for creation and transmission of specialized knowledge. It in turn helped develop the professional expertise, which is the core of the rational administrative bureaucracy, which permits the modern state a system of law, especially from the Romans, that codified legal arrangements and guaranteed rights, opening the way for vast trading areas and state administration. Double entry bookkeeping is a standard accounting tool that permitted complex fiscal transactions and ways of monitoring firms at a distance. He only alludes to these non-religious points here, but explores them in more detail in other books on ancient Judaism, the religions of China, India, bureaucracy, Roman law, and so forth. But the overall focus of the effort was to specify what was distinctive to the West and how and why leading institutions of Western society involved in their distinctive form. As we saw in Class, Status, and Party, he clearly differed from Marx in stressing a multi-causal explanation. Status, and he said we can explode status in terms of all sorts of additional subdimensions, or situs, as Daniel Bell has done, for instance. And this, in a sense, we could say is similar to what I just said about the current political system with Berlusconi, with the U.S. Congress, with city, etc. That is, as citizens get more educated and they get more involved, we have new movements. Me Too emerges. How does that fit with unions, etc., etc. This implies more multi-causality or complexity. In this context, the Protestant ethic chose just two variables, but both are critical enough to illuminate far more. The simple thesis is that the two have a clear linkage, a distinct association. Causal, maybe. Elective affinity, quote unquote, is the term that Weber borrowed from Goethe to refer to the convergence or congruity of ideas and institutions, but to avoid the sharp idea of causality. So we have both the Protestant ethic leading to spirit of capitalism, and instead of having one causal arrow going then the other way, the way Christina Sakamoto talked about on Monday, You could have one arrow or one line with two arrows aiming in both directions. That is, it joins both of these. There is an association, but it's not necessarily causality. And what is, what are each of these concepts, and what is causality? Anyway, but the simple big points he's making is that what is capitalism? That greed and trade were universal and ancient. Capitalism is the making of profit and the renewed profit via a continuous capitalist enterprise, not capitalistic adventurism of making more money fast is simply common. That depended on blunder or the whims of a prince or whatever. What is distinctive for modern capitalism, including far more? So 5 points. 1, rationally organized activity. 2, oriented toward a market. 3, supported by rational bookkeeping. 4, separate from the family. That's a big one for Asia. That is, these things are interpenetrating much more in the Asian, or let's say Southern European context than in the Northern European. 5th, free labor that could be bought and sold as part of an economic calculus. And in that sense, all of these constitute the spirit which Weber stresses. This effort to fathom the deep structure, and that is not to have business dominance, but to have the underlying conception in that sense, which Weber saw in building on, and here's one important bottom line, building on the German idealistic tradition, the Hegelian spirit of the age, which Hegel would talk about, and so he could talk about periods of history or the spirit of this or that. In brief, he uses a very broad definition encompassing many distinctly Western economic institutions, much broader than Marx's definition of capitalism. At the center of these institutions is also the essence of rational economic organization and ethos. The spirit of capitalism he focuses on and uses as a major illustration the writings of whom? Who does he draw on? Anybody know that? Simple Q&A kind of question for a multiple. Okay. Benjamin Franklin, the colonial America, well known, where capitalism was less mixed with aristocratic elements of Western culture. And Franklin was a national hero. Precepts like time is money, a penny saved is a penny earned. This ostensibly focused monograph is packed with footnotes that aim high in terms of theory. For example, quote, page 51, the earning of more and more money is completely devoid of any hedonistic admixture. It is thought of purely as an end in itself, and from the standpoint of the happiness or utility to the single individual, it appears entirely transcendental and completely irrational. This is clearly an attack on the utilitarian Benthamite tradition of economics and psychology and happiness studies, if you only take a narrow, crude definition of happiness. Or page 61, quote, too large a reserve army may in certain cases favor its quantitative expansion, checks its qualitative development. Quote, low wages do not pay and their effect is the opposite of what was intended. So no reference made or needed, no more general statement of position. Then he goes into a review of different Protestant teachings to stress the idea of the calling in Calvinism, that one could be saved in the eyes of God by doing good works. Through the Puritan demonstrated his efforts towards salvation. A sober, ascetic, parsimonious ethic was prized by such a religious outlook. though Calvinist by the end of his life, or in the children of his children or grandchildren achieved great wealth, this was a mere byproduct. Worse, it was a danger, since it could tempt and erode the austerity and piousness that created it initially. Such concerns filled the diaries of proper Bostonians in the 18th century, and I would add today, Silicon Valley. I've seen some of the publications or summaries of websites of lead foundations in Silicon Valley. Many of their concerns are, how can we keep our children from having some of the magic which has made Silicon creativity so successful, and not become too hedonistic, too short-term oriented, too short time perspective, too narrow, etc. Historically, or thinking of, and the kinds of scandals we have from Bill, that is at the time of Bill Clinton, which sparked some of this with the scandals over that, and then with Trump continuing. These are very much the kind of concerns of sort of a proper middle class morality style was a big concern for these kinds of folks. Historically, the inner logic of the Puritan ethos has taken place, but so has far more. Even Weber stressed, over a century ago. The byproduct is the external construction of massive capitalistic institutions that lock us all into an iron cage, his famous label. The Puritans of old may have disappeared or been transformed, but their ghosts haunt the institutional legacy all around us. And criticisms of the Weber thesis have been continuous and voluminous. Spuriousness. The bourgeoisie was led to embrace Protestantism and capitalism simultaneously. A third variable leads to the same two, not that it's the Protestant ethic. Catholicism is not as anti-rational as Weber implied, so the Protestant distinctiveness is overstated. We had almost no serious evidence, certainly not quantitative. He cited one empirical study that has since been seriously challenged. Many other subsequent empirical studies have often not found support in other contexts, although some have. Yet we continue to read and learn from this work. The critical message is that more general than the rise of capitalism. It's more about modernism or about rationality, the modern life, etc. And it speaks to a key question: what is an analytical source of values and preferences? Okay, this is a big one, and it links in that sense as well to Black. I mean, Black's idea of where are the values and what's the distribution of those preferences. This is a huge weakness of economic analysis. How define the preferences and where do they come from? How do you fill this conceptual void left by economic analysis of utility functions? Weber's Protestant ethics supplies an answer to Parsons's utilitarian dilemma. I'll talk about that. Weber describes how a critical set of values emerged and was codified and helped shape the ends, means, and conditions of individuals, these terms of Parsons. It redefined pain and pleasure. Surely the ebullient, sociable, and spontaneous Neapolitan cafe waiter would not consider pleasure those activities glorified by Calvin or by Ben Franklin, and vice versa. Read the embarrassed commentaries of Franklin himself, as this American, or even more, as he wrote when Franklin was in Paris, or even more Henry James or Ezra Pound, as they explored the dangerous seductions of Paris and Rome. In the cantos of, the critique of the Protestant ethic thesis is explicit and discussed by Ezra Pound. The Protestant ethic was clearly transmitted across individuals, families, generations, cities, countries, and this is obvious in the examples from Switzerland, Britain, Scandinavia, and the U.S. Used by Weber. What Weber adds is how, along with the assistance from other, especially theologians, there emerged an increasingly codified and rationalized value system, which in turn defined a set of preferences as part of a broader worldview. And two other examples quickly. Tourville, which I'd mentioned briefly with Rokan, the coasts of Norway were very different from the center of Norway. And so the Roman Catholic Church stayed in the center, and the coast developed Calvinism. And why? Rokan doesn't go into so much detail. Henri de Tourville, a French Roman Catholic priest, critic of Durkheim, built on the empirical work of the fjords by their collaborators in their group, and they basically said that a fjord, a little harbor, a little inlet, is small enough to support a nuclear family. But this was argued against. That is, this was argued as a geographic formulation. The natural history of those little fjords encouraged the nuclear family rather than a big extended family, such as you had more of in Germany or France or China. And in that way, the seafaring Normans came from that constellation around the nuclear family, the individual, and going to the sea, to the ocean as a way of exploring. And so Leif Erikson discovered America maybe 400 years earlier than Christopher Columbus, maybe.
Eric the Red.
Right, yes. Okay, so, all right, so that, if you will, that's one kind of alternative.
Who said this Durkheim now? Who said this? Rockens is the one who said that about Norway, right?
This is a French theologian, Henri de Tourville. So my book on
But that was not in the readings.
It fits with Rokan.
Yeah.
So it connects and adds specificity to Rokan's analysis. The coastal cities is often studied for China, and including as well Shanghai, versus the north in Beijing, which reinforced the coastal connection to the oceans, made more easy a more cosmopolitan worldview, and this could be an alternative to having the Protestant ethic, if you will. So the coastal connections are similarly, in the case of Switzerland, the mountains kept out the German armies, and the English Channel kept away the French, although when the political system got weaker in England, or they divided among their leadership, then the France nearby Normandy was a combination of the French with the Normans who had settled in Normandy, and so William the Conqueror was a French Norman leader of the who became King of England. Okay, so Weber suggested various developments stifled the expansion of the West. This is, and in some respects things have changed. For instance, In the case of China, he used maybe 10 or so ideal types. Instead of saying there's a basic value for all of China, he says don't. There are too many differences among and within China, and look at the ideal types. There are peasants, there are national bureaucrats, there are overseas Chinese who are traders and entrepreneurs who are much closer to the Western entrepreneurs. And so many people have focused on those overseas Chinese, and they have been, like many of those Western entrepreneurs, highly successful economically in the Philippines, in South Africa, and other countries linked with China. But what they don't have is the separation from the family and the use of markets. That is, the traditional relationships tend to be personalistic in most of the Asian variations of these. And so basically, I won't try to summarize everything else, but basically those are some of the big points which feed into the rest of this course and these themes. Okay. Question?
Can we ask a question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
You mentioned that the coastal cities.
Can we turn the camera?
You mentioned the coastal cities, and you put the example of Shanghai and Beijing, yeah, and you put the example of the fjords and the ones in the middle of Norway, which is not the fjords, yeah. And the question that I have, you're saying that the coastal cities are more cosmopolitan, yeah? And is that the reason why coastal cities have more violence than landlocked cities?
I think the quick answer is Weber didn't talk about it. And in terms of, there are lots of other things. In terms of the general question is, did the driver the coastal cities like Shanghai, or that is there are lots of other places which don't have fjords, yeah. And so I guess my quick answer is likely to be, if we're going to have anything as complicated and as distant a causal series of connections, we have a coastal city and crime over here. There are at least 10 other factors in between. And if you multiply the importance of the first to the last, it's going to be near trivial, way below 15%, less than 1%.
That's important.
So there may be a little bit of a tendency, but there are too many other factors to try to say anything very serious.
That's very good.
Okay. Durkheim. But I guess the big one in between is that even in the last century, we have the internet, air travel, fast communication. These have weakened the significance of coastal cities as a major driver of cosmopolitanism and communication. That we don't have to go in person in a ship to learn about China and in the West. That is, you turn on you can have a session today, and we had a session yesterday in our class based on a symposium in Beijing yesterday on Saturday night. So so there's instant communication globally through Zoom and through things like this. Zoom alone has transformed a whole lot of things very fast. Okay. Durkheim. And so Durkheim, in a sense, is closer to addressing what I'm mentioning here, in the sense that let me get to that. Like Weber, Durkheim sought to found a more rigorous social science, and he took on the alternatives: utilitarianism, Marxism, biological determinism. And like Weber, he did so often in the context of a monograph that sought to demonstrate a better interpretation of a similar phenomenon that others had studied previously. Thus, his books on suicide and the division of labor. He here illustrated the general precept that the best way to present a convincing theoretical position is not simply attack, but to choose a key problem for the old theory and show you can answer it more convincingly, and ideally subsuming the previous theory in the process, showing how it is only partial, it's not directly wrong. So you hear me say this many times. Add the context and then play up a lot the context of where and why the theory it does work. Okay. And with Weber, Durkheim introduced the systematic study of values and culture, yet not as yet another single and solitary determinism, as characterized most of the 19th century theories of biology or heredity or violence or flat land or whatever. Thus, Durkheim and Weber both considered values and culture, but in a framework along with other variables. That's important. They didn't say this is a simple Hegelian idealistic determinism. Instead, the division of labor, Durkheim strikes right at the core concept of economics, the Western theory of the market, and argues that its explanation by contract theorists is lacking. The tradition from Locke, Smith, Mill, and Spencer is inadequate, he held. Why? Because it was correct, Durkheim held, to stress the division of labor. Yes, the contract, yes, and their assigned roles in an increasingly complex economy. But the tradition is wrong, he felt, in what was omitted from the contract was more important than what was included. This is like Duncan Black as well, and Arrow and Samuelson. It was the underlying assumptions, the shared culture that provided the foundation, the flying buttress, without which persons could not write contracts or develop an advanced division of labor. Like Weber, he sought to elucidate the ethical and cultural requisites, the foundational and critical elements that support the modern economic system. And in the process, of course, in doing so, he, like Weber, showed inevitably how utilitarian and historical materialist interpretations were inadequate. Not wrong, just inadequate. So I suggest you read first the section on mechanical solidarity. The argument is simplest. The problem of order is solved. The Hobbesian Locke problem is solved in a different way, in this case by considering a simple and homogeneous society, a little town, a village. What maintains the order? Crime. To answer, Durkheim does not look directly at what he wants to show, which is the basic values. He suggests rather that if we look at the general constitutions and the civil codes, they are reasonable but too vague. They leave out the more critical assumptions, which they are left unspoken since they're taken for granted. Look, he says, instead at the average person, look not at the average person to understand the rule, but look at those people who try to violate it. What happens to them? The deviants are punished. Crime. And he thus suggests that the penal code supplies a precise and powerful indicator of the fundamental beliefs of a society. But so Durkheim waves the penal code to us and is clearly delighted to find a tangible example of basic values in operation. But he goes far beyond what a lawyer would observe. Why are crimes wrong and what supports the punishment, he asks. Here is his quintessential social and, alas, at sometimes sociologistic Durkheim. Sociologistic and underplaying the individual and other potential factors. He tells us that the penal code merits our attention since it identifies crimes which, in a sentence which may have overstated his own case, says, quote, crimes are acts universally approved of by members of each society. Okay, each society is, I guess, the qualification. if that means little village versus Paris. What are the core values, often unspoken and only implicit? On page 79, he introduces his most famous concept: the totality of beliefs and sentiments common to average citizens of the same society forms a determinate system which has its own life.
What page is that?
One could call page 79, which one may call it the collective or common conscience, la conscience collective in French, sometimes since it denotes both consciousness as well as conscience in England. Occasionally, like Weber, he takes a jab at the utilitarians. For example, on page 82, pain and pleasure are only derivative facts. An act is socially bad because society disapproves of it. He thus moves to a social determinism in some pages. But how can this social constraint, this collective consciousness, operate in a complex society? Okay, here's a big question. When we move up from the village that differentiates into many subparts, the answer, he contrasts what he terms mechanical and organic solidarity. Mechanical is founded on common values shared by all, and this alone suffices in an undifferentiated social system. But organic solidarity can operate with an advanced division of labor. The division of labor loosens the individual from normative and social constraints and potentially loosen him so much that suicide and crime can result. His solution is spelled out in his introduction. Corporatism, or we call professional associations, which join persons who engage in the same economic activity. These he saw as a modern solution. Some have seen this as leading to this term of corporatism as leading to fascism that Schmitter describes in the next section. We'll read about a little bit below. But the main point is that the term corporatism is simply that you just strike that out and use professional associations, and that's what we're talking about, which is mostly in his mind. In this sense, this analysis leads directly to Parsons' papers on the professions and collegial authority as an egalitarian substitute for hierarchical bureaucracy or utilitarian payoffs. For Parsons and for professional collegiality, these are the solution to integration in a post-industrial, post-bureaucratic society. One might try to join this with Bowles and Gintis. They have a more lively writing style. Gouldner, others, and so forth. These I won't try to go into. Durkheim's and Parsons' ideas here are explicitly developed by other post-revolutionaries, such as Habermas, now as a fellow student of the Frankfurt School. He and other post-68 writers have similarly developed the same idea of collegial responsibility as a means of abolishing hierarchy and privilege in society in general. And I have as well feminist support groups. Yes.
Habermas was a communist, yeah? He was from
Who?
Habermas, yeah? He was from the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School they were communists, right?
Officially, yes, but even in Adorno, as I said, there were two Adornos, the crude and the sophisticated. And when we get to Habermas, it becomes much more subtle. And so we can talk a little more, but the one simple takeaway to remember is Habermas stressed the cafe in France could not be a forum for politics because the strong state prohibited it. In England, it was the opposite. This was the source of the London stock market, insurance companies, John Locke, political tracts. All this stuff was discussed openly in the English coffee houses. And so in that sense, he adds these institutional differences between between the English, especially France and Germany, and in that sense, England as well as Switzerland and the Netherlands are exceptions from the. Okay, so Habermas has a lot of, I would say, multi-causality. And this was his big thesis, his Habilitationsschrift. But more important, that was when Adorno and Horkheimer were alive, when Habermas took the mantle directly and became the professor at Frankfurt. This was then after 68, and the kinds of solutions which Lipset and Rokan gave us, we've seen already. Habermas went much further. He became much more looking at social interaction, multiple types of organized groups, new social movements, feminism. He was very much in sync of trying to join empirical, those big changes, with the theory. So he wanted to change the theory to add. So he then himself, and all the more others, look to the American pragmatists and the American cases of having things like the looking glass self or the Chicago, that side of culture within the American context. William James, Charles Saunders Peirce, John Dewey, the lab school here, these were the drivers of a certain kind of value generating system, which was not at all Marxist, but basically the idea was to join the empiricism, the better label is pragmatism, which was certainly by no means anti-theoretical. It was a different theory. It was not Marxist. But what Habermas and others have done here is to join these traditions through connecting Max Weber with through Parsons, which we're getting to here. So let me jump ahead. Important point here is that Durkheim provided a more explicit set of propositions than even did Weber about where and when certain cultural elements interpenetrate government and economic institutions in ways that they defined and reinforced their operation. Weber was an economic historian by career, and his background was the German historical school. Quiet there, folks. And the idealistic tradition.
It's Columbia here.
Yes, okay. Maybe they're building a tent. Which denied the possibility of formulating. Listen, we'll go to Zoom. The rest of the class, okay. And denied the by contrast, Durkheim was the first professor of sociology in a university anywhere in the world. He was a major national figure in creating a secular ideology for the Third Republic, to teach in its schools, in part to undermine the Catholic schools. Durkheim lectured to a public school teachers on how to teach secular ethics. This was one practical application of the sort he refers to in the division of labor. And much of this was done in an anti-German manner, such as especially 1914 approach, that Durkheim and his students were leading writers of French wartime prose. Some might say propaganda. Durkheim was always a patriot and nationalist, and thus sought to join his ideas with a line of French positivism and from Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte. Comte himself lived the sad life of an ignored prophet, whereas Durkheim became one of the most revered patrons of the French university. So my book was called Prophets and Patrons. Durkheim thus waved the flag more than Weber and outlined a more specific program for sociologists. And I analyzed these, as I mentioned, Prophets and Patrons, the French University and the Emergence of the Social Sciences, and which is still the definitive work, or so my friends tell me. Okay, Bourdieu has the competition, but whatever. Okay, let's go on. Let's join these together in the synthesis. Talk at Parsons. These two readings are key illustrations of the emerging synthesis at the turn of the century between previously warring intellectual traditions. Weber and Durkheim each overcame their pasts that Parsons both analyzed and himself advanced in especially the structure of social action, 1937. Parsons' essay in our course, the reading list, have on the reading list, is a summary largely built on that essay, that book. It is arguably the most influential book on sociological theory in the 20th century. It's a very difficult book to read, even for professional sociologists, and considered impenetrable by decades of graduate students, some of whom have dropped out of sociology, or at least they left Harvard or left Parsons.
That's Parsons, yeah?
Yes, Parsons. The corpus of works by Weber, Durkheim, Pareto, and Alfred Marshall is vast, and Parsons, in reading, synthesizing, and then pushing their analyses substantially further, took on a very ambitious task. Most social scientists are far more modest. Even most theoretical works today are much more narrow. Most extend a single tradition of theory, so a creative synthesis of many of these traditions is seldom thought about or discussed. Academic turf battles are usually over limited ideas, like case studies versus statistics, or radical versus conservative politics, or empiricist versus theorist. These are easier to learn in a quarter or two, and while it takes a decade or more just to master the complexities that Parsons addressed, reread it in 10 years and you will see, and read it again in 20 years. Let me review just a few key ideas from this. Actually, we were going to show this Monday. Do you have that handy to show? No. Okay. Yeah. Is that neat? You see I'm pretty sure I sent you that
Okay.
email. Yeah. Why don't you try to set
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
You set that up while I'll talk about it.
Sure.
The main traditions of social theory through the 19th century each had distinctive blind spots. Big points here. 19th century theory had strong traditions. They were single and solitary in a more deterministic way. The gaps were filled in various ways by proponents with each of these traditions, usually by making strong assumptions or limiting the analysis to certain types of cases. The gaps are most simply demonstrated by starting with a properly complete theory, which Parsons calls the voluntaristic theory of action, unquote. This is the theoretical approach which Parsons himself drew from Weber and Durkheim. It includes a unit act, the unit act composed of 5 critical elements. It differs from the main past theories in that each of these omitted one or more critical factors. Here, okay, exactly, good and fast, that's great. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay. This is my figure and labels. Parsons used more abstract, he doesn't have it, Parsons does not give you a one-page summary. This is the summary of I think it's an 800-page book. So I'm summarizing 800 pages in one little table. So Parsons never tried to do this, but he's close. I mean, he does it in a short essay, which is on the reading list. But this is my summary, which you can connect this to what he's written, and you can see it still takes him 15 pages, whereas I've got 1 page. All right. Parsons uses more abstract terms. For instance, number 2, the Darwin-Skinner, he calls rational anti-intellectual individualistic positivism, unquote. In brief, the utilitarians and social Darwinians, the first two I show there, omitted, okay, so the problem with the first two is they omitted norms. They stress and they omitted the ends. I mean, why, this is the preference goal of classic economic analysis. What do people want to maximize preference? If you want to maximize what? What are preferences? Economists don't know. They say, they omit this basically. The Darwin Skinner, the same, but even worse. The means are omitted. Utilitarian social Darwinians omitted norms and thus experienced famous label of Parsons, the utilitarian dilemma, or the randomness of ends. They could not, so he says many pages by Parsons on this. They could not explain what people wanted or why. And again, this is in Wildavsky. There's a whole chapter of Wildavsky here at the beginning on preferences. And basically, Wildavsky points out, just continuing the same kind of view as Parsons here. It's tough, and nobody's answered it very coherently, so they try to give us an answer. For Darwin, the dilemma is answered, and the theory is closed by a fallback to heredity and environment. For utilitarians of the 19th century, to the famous categories of pain and pleasure, or in the 20th century, maximizing utility. But if we all know these categories today, we also know they are so general, they do not tell us very much. And that's, I would say, the problem with Arrow and Samuelson and Duncan Black. The first two traditions of theory do not specify where and why pain or pleasure emerge. They do not distinguish a Puritan's pleasure in sober prayer from the pleasures of drink and song of our Neapolitan waiter. Both are random ends. At another pole stands sociologism, where Durkheim sometimes fell into, where norms are so powerfully imposed on the individual that he has no choice. Like the criminal sanctions in a simple society, society controls the in and out with no choice. If this is in some of Durkheim's more programmatic and anti-psychologistic writings, read elsewhere, such as his essays on intellectuals and individualism, and you'll see a subtle and sensitive treatment of these themes. Durkheim was too smart to be always sociologistic. The German, okay, so that's number 3, is Durkheim, sociologism. Society imposes on everybody. Okay. And you also see that in, say, in a number of the Chinese. So the Chinese sort of say, you don't have any choice. The party, or you can't think, you can't freely in China. But whereas, not true. Okay, the German idealistic tradition. So number 4 here had stressed the autonomy of culture, but omitted the institutional specifics, like markets, competition, so stressed by the utilitarians and the Darwinians. Its critical addition to the utilitarian tradition was what Hegel called Geist, spirit, which in Parsons becomes basic values. In this framework, this includes both ends and norms, these two columns. Things like the Protestant ethic, it contributed an element that thus complemented the utilitarian's weakness. So what Parsons is doing is putting these together, of saying we can see the strength of each of these, but they also have their weaknesses. And so his bottom line, number 5 down here, is what Parsons has said, this is what I will do. But he doesn't say, I'm inventing it. He says, it's in Weber, it's in Durkheim, it's in Alfred Marshall. Other people are doing this, but they haven't put the pieces together. This in a sense, where what we're doing with scenes theory is making a similar argument, but we're just going further. Adding the scene like the cafe, and Habermas did the cafe specifics. It's not the cafe, it's what you can do in the cafe, and what you can do in the cafe depends heavily on the state in his analysis. The state in that sense is not a Marxist category. It's not the economic, it's, okay. His own work consisted more of typologies than of laws, if by laws we understand causal statements like A causes B. But this was in dealing with this whole body of well, okay, I won't try to add, I'll just stick with my narrower statement. More important than Parsons' specific contribution was his more general impact on others. He helped import European social theory into the U.S. Major point. He and Parsons and Schills here in Chicago translated the Protestant ethic, law, essays, introducing many of these and building an integrated theory connecting the general theories with the middle level propositions and the empirical work of Chicago and Columbia. Parsons invited Schills to Harvard in 1950 when they wrote a book, and then later the book, which is on our reading list, Theories of Society. Schills's epilogue to the book's Theories of Society is a coherent articulation of his own perspective on these issues. Schills was active in starting the Committee on the Comparative Study of the New Nations at Chicago, including especially political scientists like David Apter and Leonard Binder, and anthropologists like Clifford Geertz. One of Schills's students was Gabriel Almond. His sister Schills married. Almond went to Yale and Princeton and chaired the Committee on Comparative Politics in the Social Science Research Council in the 50s and 60s. It sought to develop an abstract framework for comparing political systems, especially non-Western. Schills and Almond wrote several papers that were increasingly codified in works like Almond and Coleman, The Politics of Developing Areas, or Almond and Verba, The Civic Culture. This was mainstream political science from about 1960 to 70. And this included culture consists of values, norms, and institutions. So this is building on these dimensions that Parsons stressed here. The institutions that relate to the political system, including certain values like the Protestant ethic, or let's say basic values, or equality, which has increased in salience, especially over the 20th century. Norms are more specific than values and state how people should act. When the traffic light changes from red to green, you should stop. That's a norm, that's not a value. Institutions are complexes of roles such as governments, parties, or social movements. Roles such as mayor or citizen have norms defining their appropriate activities. Roles include both formal and informal elements, and this kind of political culture approach differs from past work in these ways. And so Schills really developed political culture, and with Gabriel Almond implementing it, and then Verba and the others continued it further. It breaks with the, and Lipset, as we've discussed a bit, and we'll do more. It breaks with the established traditions of descriptive legal analysis, history of government, constitutional law, which were the staples of, quote, government before it was renamed political science. These were hot issues in the 60s. Harvard never changed its, I still don't think it's called political science. I think it's still called the Department of Government.
Yes, still go up.
Yeah. So the political culture stresses the informal elements are only partially captured by formal arrangements, laws, institutions. It signals the embeddedness of these institutions in a more general social and cultural patterns. Instead of analyzing the Chicago City Council through its legal history, the aldermen tell us that the elections are nonpartisan. No parties in Chicago. This is the strongest local party in the U.S. But it's officially like California. So the law doesn't tell us at all. It suggests looking at the councils, a political cultural perspective suggests looking at the council's interpenetration by political parties, religious groups, ethnic groups that have defined their own actual operating norms, its rules from Daley to Washington to where we are now. The importance of these political cultural changes are more visible in cross-national and in third world areas. And I would add, when Lenin adopted when the communist success after 1917 in Russia, the Constitution looks almost the same as the U.S. Constitution. Doesn't tell you what Lenin was doing. Okay. The interpenetration of Islam, the Napoleonic Code. History then came several things. The Vietnam War helped end international research. The funds dried up and Americans were suspected of imperialism. Cross-national comparisons dropped off. Student protests sought a radical outlook that found the Frankfurt School more appealing than Schill's, Parsons, and Almond. Other students, turned off by these ideological excesses, avoided theory and studied methodology and statistics alone. Ethnography today is another alternative, talking about ethnography as a methodology instead of talking about any real content. When young political scientists and economists did do theory, they often leaned toward a radical approach that stressed direct populist democracy and mathematical modeling. Anthony Downs and Public Choice then rose to fame. The late 60s with ecologists, feminists, human rights, we saw dramatic changes with politics and political features, bringing more equality and populist involvement of citizens, a greater role of the national government in social programs, a new role for radical protest groups, and new movements of all sorts in the US, Europe, much of the rest of the world. That is, these movements helped change the political cultures of their societies quite dramatically, enough so that many observers felt they need a more relativistic theory to help explain the changes. So Vildovsky, whose theory of incrementalism seemed increasingly inappropriate to him, he embraced the idea of political culture only in the early 1980s, but has since been actively developing the idea. I myself grew increasingly convinced of the importance of political culture only in the 1970s, in comparing cities with quite different styles of policies. So my paper on the Irish ethic led and legitimated patronage politics, for instance. I went to Yugoslavia and to Guinea and French West Africa to see the workings of more Marxist kinds of would-be societies and how different they were from other aspects of the world. By the 80s, a narrowly utilitarian approach of public choice grew increasingly recognized, especially in political science. These were in the 90s toward the new emphasis on the idea of political culture. Again, some building more directly on these above traditions, others seeking to emerge with methods from anthropology and linguistics, from Levi-Strauss, Mary Douglas. However defined, it's a new lively concern. So applying some of these 5 elements, these complement one another, and I see an integrated, not just me alone, but I'm pointing especially to Gary Becker, to Schills, to Piaget, with whom I studied in Paris, in addition to Levi-Strauss. Piaget answered a number of other things about the interpenetration of the psychological and the economic and socialization, so that in a sense you can have the strong state, the strong family telling young children, and they follow the rules. When they get to 18 or 19 or 20 and 21, they begin to test and challenge, and they think for themselves. They go to universities, and they've then got these peer groups that can include Me Too and other things, and that in turn can throw upside down the old rules of the game. Okay, so I see this as more like the older debates in the natural sciences between different theoretical traditions, like Newtonian mechanics, as an analog to rational choice, that we don't need to throw out the whole thing, but simply say, how can we find the sources of friction, these intervening variables? But these things, and I would point to the whole disciplines of anthropology going in one drastically different direction versus economics, whereas much more following Gary Becker. Becker himself read the structure of social action seriously. Bourdieu, even to take a faraway case, Bourdieu, I had a personal conversation with him once. I said, would you ever want to visit America and talk to some of this? I mean, most of the sociologists in the world are in the U.S. They're not here in Paris. He said, if I would go to America, I would want to go because I would want to see Gary Becker. He would bring me here. But because my English is so bad and he doesn't speak French, we could not communicate, so I'll stay here in Paris. But to have even a Bourdieu, say Becker is the genius that would really bring me to America, is an illustration of how Becker in turn has drastically transformed the whole economics discipline. So his students now are here and writing books like Freakonomics and other things, which are bringing together with and so. Steve Levitt, the author, co-author there, is really even sometimes calls himself a data scientist, not an economist. Okay, so he writes about gangs, subcultures, crime, all sorts of things. Okay, let me stop with that. How are we doing on time here? So, wow, it's already 6 o'clock. No, we're supposed to end. We're supposed to end at 10:06, so I'm over time. Apologies. Why don't you run through quickly your 5 questions? We'll see how those are they easier. That is, my general point is what the book does of Fildovsky is to go through several dozen challenges, questions, hard problems, and then he gives his solutions as to where and how these can be resolved, and basically it builds on everything that I talked about before, I would say. But he's okay. So, but any quick questions from that?
You want to go?
Yeah, I do have to go.
See, because we're over time, maybe she wants to go.
Sure, that's fine. We'll try to continue in the future, and that is, I would say, if you want to have one thing to take a look at the book Scenescapes.